Jennings Bryan's career was really contained within two watershed events. Early on in his career, there was the great economic collapse of 1893. Farms were foreclosed on, a series of banks were closed, unemployment was high, and strife and division within a nation was huge. At the end of his career, William Jennings Bryan was involved in probably the most famous trial ever. It was a battle between Clarence Darrow and Bryan over the idea of whether or not evolution could be taught inside the high schools.
Politically, Bryan entered into the ring in 1880, campaigning for Winfield Scott Hancock, the Democratic Party's nomination for the presidency, campaigning in his hometown of Salem, Illinois. In 1884, Bryan would use his oratory talent in support of Grover Cleveland's bid for the presidency. In 1887, the Bryans moved to Nebraska. In Nebraska, he was nominated as a delegate to the Democratic State Convention in 1888. At 28 years of age, Bryan was the youngest voter at the convention. The stage was now set for Bryan's rise to power inside of the Democratic Party.
In 1896, William Jennings Bryan was nominated to the National Convention. He went to the National Democratic Convention in Chicago to nominate a presidential candidate for the Democrats. Nobody really suspected what would happen next. When the convention was done and the Democratic nominee had been chosen, it was the 36-year-old William Jennings Bryan. The issue was, should silver be included with gold in the monetary standard? The problem was that in 1896, they were still suffering from the 1893 collapse of the banks. And the idea that the people had was that what they really needed was more money. Now, we want more money, and the only way we can do that is really by earning it or maybe borrowing it. And at the time, banks were not lending. It just wasn't happening. The banks had collapsed and they were being very careful with money. So loans were scarce. But in 1896, another way of getting money was to find gold. And what you would do is, if you had a gold mine, you could go into your mine and you could take gold out of it and then take it to a mint. And the mint would make gold coins for you for a nominal fee. And money would be increased inside of the country or inside of the society. The problem was that would only happen with gold. And what William Jennings Bryan wanted was to include silver into that idea. In other words, it wasn't just gold that you took to the mint. You could take silver, which was at the time a cheaper metal, and you could take that to the mint and have silver coins made. Again, increasing the amount of money within the society. The worry was from the East was that it would increase inflation. William Jennings Bryan argued that their worry over inflation was actually selfish. He said to the farmers that they want your farm to be worth the same today or less than it was yesterday, where you want it to be more or to provide you with more income. And so for William Jennings Bryan, inflation was not a bad idea. Other countries had already brought in silver standard, China being one of them. But the United States was solid on gold only. And this would become the battle and the platform for the 1896 presidential campaign.
William Jennings Bryan was a phenomenal speaker, but the campaign of 1896 and the question of gold and silver set him up for what is probably the best speech he ever gave. Listen.
Mr. Carlyle said in 1878 that this was a struggle between the idle holders of idle capital and the struggling masses who produce the wealth and pay the taxes of the country. They tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city of the country. We care not upon what line the battle is fought. If they say bimetallism is good, but that we cannot have it until other nations help us, we reply that instead of having a gold standard, because England has, we will restore bimetallism, and then let England have bimetallism because the United States has. If they dare to come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we will fight them to the uttermost. Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
Under normal circumstances, campaigns for the presidency are not epic struggles that inspire allegory. But the presidential campaign of 1896 was not conducted under normal circumstances. All of the drama that led up to the 1896 presidential election appears to have inspired Frank Baum to write an allegory covering the extraordinary events. The book was The Wizard of Oz.
We're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz. We hear he is the Wizard of Wiz, if ever a Wiz there was. If ever a Wiz there was, the Wizard of Oz is one because of the wonderful things he does. We're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz.
According to the theory, Dorothy was actually William Jennings Bryan, and the Scarecrow, the farmers that he had hoped to help, and the Tin Man was the industrial workers that he hoped would come alongside and help him get to the presidency, and the Cowardly Lion was the Populist Party, who elected him as their leader along with the Democrats. Baum wrote the book in 1899 and had high hopes that in 1900 William Jennings Bryan would finally gain the presidency. But he never got there. The shoes, which by the way were silver, not ruby, never brought him home.
With the thoughts you'd be thinking you could be another Lincoln if you only had a brain.
At the end of William Jennings Bryan's career, he entered into a legal battle. The idea that he had championed was that the theory of evolution, especially the theory of evolution that humans evolved from earlier existing animals, should not be taught to high school students. His reason was really this. He had just lived through World War I, and he saw the conflict that was there. And he saw that in what he considered to be Darwin's view of evolution, especially social evolution, that conflicts like World War I were actually inevitable. They were part of the struggle of the fittest. And he could not believe that God would create such a struggle where fights like World War I, the Great War, were just part of what it took to be human. And so he rebelled against the idea. And in 1925, in Tennessee had just put in a law that said it was illegal. It was the first test of the law. The test case was a substitute teacher named John Scopes. He was the perfect candidate. Number one, he was a substitute teacher. He had no plans of permanence. Number two, he was a visitor in Tennessee. He was not part of the Tennessee state. Number three, he had no long-term plans to stay in Tennessee. Win or lose, John Scopes could move on to whatever it was that he had planned for him afterwards. Number four, he was single. There was nobody else that would be brought down by the trial.
The trial would happen in Dayton, Tennessee. The little town was renamed Monkeyville for the duration of the trial, and the inhabitants understood the power of what was taking place in their little town. They knew that the nation was watching them, and they even staged a train crash, as seen here in this video, to demonstrate the power of the forces that were coming together in their small little town.
And so there was this collaboration where the prosecution and the defense came together at Robinson's drugstore. And there they discussed the possibility of prosecuting Scopes for teaching evolution. Whether or not Scopes actually taught evolution is still very much a matter of argument. He was a substitute teacher. He was not there for the full term. But he was willing to say he did, and was willing to take the pressure of the trial. When the law was enacted, Bryan actually argued that there should be no penalty to the law. His fear was that they would make martyrs to the cause if there was a penalty. But lawmakers disregarded what Bryan had said, and they put a fine in as the penalty for teaching evolution.
What resulted was one of the strangest trials in history, culminating when Clarence Darrow called William Jennings Bryan to be a witness for the defense.
How old do you think this rock is? I am more interested in the Rock of Ages than I am in the age of rocks. Dr. Page of Oberlin College tells me this rock is at least 10 million years old. Well, Colonel Drummond, you managed to sneak in some of that scientific testimony after all. Look, Mr. Brady, these are the fossil remains of a marine prehistoric creature found in this very county and which lived here millions of years ago when these very mountain ranges were submerged in water.
Well, I know. The Bible gives a fine account of the flood. But your professor's a little mixed up on his dates. That rock is not more than 6,000 years old.
How do you know?
A fine biblical scholar, Bishop Usher, has determined for us the exact date and hour of the creation. It occurred in the year 4004 BC.
Well, that's Bishop Usher's opinion.
It's not an opinion. It's a literal fact, which the good bishop arrived at through careful computation of the ages of the prophets as set down in the Old Testament. In fact, he determined that the Lord began the creation on the 23rd of October, 4004 BC at 9 a.m.
At Eastern Standard Time? Or Rocky Mountain Time? It wasn't daylight saving time, was it? Because the Lord didn't make the sun until the fourth day.
That is correct.
That first day, well, what do you think? It was 24 hours long?
The Bible says it was a day.
Well, there was no sun. How do you know how long it was?
The Bible says it was a day.
Well, was it a normal day, a literal day, 24-hour day?
I don't know.
What do you think?
I do not think about things I do not think about.
Do you ever think about things that you do think about? Isn't it possible that it could have been 25 hours? There's no way to measure it, no way to tell. Could it have been 25 hours?
It's possible.
Then you interpret that the first day is recorded in the book of Genesis could have been a day of indeterminate length.
I mean to state that it is not necessarily a 24-hour day.
It could have been 30 hours. Could have been a week. Could have been a month. Could have been a year. Could have been 100 years. Or it could have been 10 million years.
I protest. This is not only irrelevant, immaterial, it is illegal. I demand to know the purpose of Mr. Drummond's examination. What's he trying to do?
I'll tell you what he's trying to do. He wants to destroy everybody's belief in the Bible and in God.
That's not true, and you know it. The Bible is a book. It's a good book, but it is not the only book.
Historians have been left with a problem. Here we have a politician that started off with an economic crisis in 1893 and a debate over silver in 1896. At the same time, he ended in 1925 with his famous trial over evolution. And historians who have looked at the broad scope of his life have seen that in William Jennings Bryan was a contradiction. In fact, some have actually asserted that somewhere between 1896 and 1925, William Jennings Bryan changed sides. But the reality is that he really didn't. In 1896 and in 1925, William Jennings Bryan defended what he believed to be the will of the common person, giving him his nickname, the Great Commoner. He defended what he felt other people were not watching. In 1896, it was simply the farmer and the worker against Wall Street and the money. In 1925, it was the atheists and this intellectual community against the common Bible-believing people of the South. For William Jennings Bryan, there really was no contradiction. It was who he was. And we may disagree with him, but from beginning to end, William Jennings Bryan defended exactly what it was that he believed.